Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot to Raoul, Clara, and Sébastien for organizing the conference. So I'm going to present a chapter that is entitled Stay at Home, a comparative analysis of the implementation of lockdowns as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's the first version. I'm like willing to have comments because I'm not sure about everything. I'm not used to use quantitative methods. So I have a lot of questions actually to ask you at the end. So as we all know, the year 2020 was marked by the implementation of lockdowns at a global scale to contain the pandemic. So facing the surge of the epidemic, all governments in Europe, with the exception of Sweden, opted for this choice. And few studies have actually analyzed the different realities that provoked lockdown measures, depending on the country in which they were implemented, and the evolution of the measures over time. So my chapter has a dual objective. It's to first to highlight the differences between countries and also to identify the factors to explain those differences. So the comparative analysis builds on the Exceptius database, and for now it covers 23 countries and it spans the first and second wave. So first I distinguish between strict and more flexible lockdowns, and secondly I looked at whether the level of coerciveness of lockdown measures were linked to the health situation in the country or to political and economic criteria, and if they had an impact on the number of deaths. So several studies have already highlighted the deeply political aspect of the measures put in place to curb the COVID-19 epidemic, as for example the trust in political institutions or the state of democracy. And other studies have also shown that, for example, during the first wave, people in countries with a low GDP were in favor of implementing measures, despite their steep economic cost. But it can be assumed that in the long term, countries with a low GDP would be less inclined to implement such measures, impacting the country's economy. And finally, other studies have also shown that the right-left axis did not seem to play a role in explaining the different type of lockdowns put in place. And considering these political and economic dimensions, I formulated 5 hypotheses. So first, during both waves, the coerciveness of the lockdown measures implemented in each country was not dependent on the intensity of the circulation of the virus. During both waves, the effectiveness of health policy was not related to the level of severity of the lockdowns. Third, during both waves, countries with the highest level of public trust in institutions implemented less restrictive lockdowns than countries with low level of trust. The fourth hypothesis, during the second wave of COVID, countries with the lowest GDP per capita implemented fewer lockdown measures than others. And 5, during both waves, the political beliefs of the ruling party didn't have any impact on the intensity of the lockdown measures. So that's where I will need your help, actually. So as I said, it was the data that I used was coded in 23 European countries for the first and second wave. And I tried to compile an indicator of the coerciveness of lockdown measures. And I did it by basing it on 7 ordinal variables, each graduating from low to high, the coercive intensity of single COVID-19 measures. So I took constraint, duty to stay at home, self-completed form, the radius, curfew, closures of venues and entertainment, and closures of non-essential shops. So for example, for duty to stay at home, 0 was for no, 1 partly, 2 for yes. For the radius, it was 0 no, 1 yes. For constraint, it was 0 none, 1 fine sentence, 2 jail sentence, 3 fine and jail sentences, and 4 expulsion from the national territory. And so the aggregation of the indicator is done as follows. For each wave and for each variable, I took into account the most coercive measures taken by a country. And I then divided each variable by the number of categories it contains. And I divided the indicator by the number of variables, so 7. So the value lies between 0 and 1. So 0 corresponds to no coercive measures at all, and 1 corresponds to the maximum possible coercive measures. So obviously there is a problem because I didn't take into account, for example, the time during which the measure was implemented. So I just took the most coercive one. So we can speak about it after to see what can be done. And then the indicator was used to examine the correlation between the intensity of coercive measures and possible contextual and structural factors regarding health, political, and economic conditions. So the variables are the numbers of deaths relative to population per million people, So I used it to see the circulation of the virus because I didn't know how to calculate it, knowing that every country calculated the number of cases differently. So I took the number of deaths at the beginning of the wave, and I also used it to see the impact of the measures, to see the number of deaths at the end of the wave. Second, the confidence in national governments in 2019. Third, the level of GDP per capita in 2019. And the political party of the government in office in March 2020. So the indicator of coercive lockdown measures show that the term lockdown actually encompassed very different realities regarding each country. I identified three groups. The light lockdown from 0 to 0.33, medium lockdowns, and strict lockdowns. So you can see the results on the PowerPoint. So the data show actually that during the first wave, 5 countries had light lockdowns and 8 during the second wave. So the first group of countries with light lockdowns is characterized by the fact that the government in place relied on responsibility of citizens rather than on coercion. And the injunction to stay at home were primarily recommendations, and many shops remained open during the period. So regarding medium lockdowns, 14 countries implemented it in the first wave, and 8 in the second wave. And so in most of these countries, governments also called on the citizens to take responsibility. For example, there was no form to fill to leave home, no time limits outside of home, no space limit, and services considered as non-essential were closed, but only for a short period of time. And finally, 3 countries implemented strict lockdowns during the first wave, so Spain, France, and Italy, and only 1 implemented a strict lockdown during the second wave, France. I will explain why after, because of the indicator. So countries such as Spain, Italy, and France, during the first wave, relied on coercion. So citizens were forbidden to leave their home except for essential reasons. So very heavy fines could be imposed and prison sentences. So citizens had to sign a form to go out, to justify for a compelling reason. And in France, for example, during the first lockdown, citizens were allowed to go out for 1 hour per day and within a maximum radius of 1 kilometer. So France is a special case. It's both in second wave and second wave in the hard lockdowns, because during the second wave, the country implemented both a strict lockdown and a curfew, whereas like the other countries decided on one or the other, but didn't implement the both. So after this, I tried to understand, to explain the intensity of the lockdowns. So first of all, when I looked at the circulation of the virus, I saw actually that during the first wave, there is a positive correlation between the circulation and the severity of the lockdowns. So the higher the level of virus circulation was, and the stricter the lockdown measures were. But during the second wave, the correlation remains positive, but it appears much later, and it's not actually significant. And regarding probable economic and political contextual factors, the analysis confirms my third hypothesis, as it reveals that during the first wave and the second wave, the lower the level of institutional trust was, the higher the intensity of coercive measure was. And regarding the GDP, actually, it seems that the GDP level is not linked with the coerciveness of implemented lockdowns during the second wave. So it actually invalidates my fourth hypothesis. And to finish, the type of political party in power does not appear to be a significant factor either to explain the decision of strong or weak lockdowns, neither during the first wave or during the second wave. And I looked also to the impact of the lockdown measures on mortality. And during the first wave, no statistical correlation exists between both. And during the second wave, only a very low correlation exists with a really weak significance. So it validates the absence of relationship between mortality and types of lockdown. And so to conclude, I would like to speak about the data, how to use it, the indicator, and also I think for the second version of the chapter, it will be interesting to study the impact of other variables, such as the democratic level of the country, hospital capacity, or trust in police. But we can speak about it together.